The dust swirled like ghosts across Thomas McCarty's weathered boots as he rode the fence line of his modest ranch in the Arizona Territory. The September sun hung merciless in the sky, painting the desert landscape in shades of amber and rust. He'd been checking for breaks, and the wire Apache raids had been troubling the territory for months, and ranchers were on edge. That's when he saw her. A figure lay crumpled near a cluster of prickly pear cactus, motionless as the rocks that dotted his land. Thomas spurred his horse forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he drew closer, he could see it was a young Apache woman, her dark hair matted with blood, her traditional dress torn and dusty. She couldn't have been more than 20. With high cheekbones and skin bronzed by the desert sun, Thomas dismounted and knelt beside her, his calloused hands trembling as he checked for signs of life. A weak pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips. Her breathing was shallow, barely there. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. How fragile. The ride back to his cabin seemed endless. Thomas had built his home with his own hands 3 years ago, after the war had taken everything from him, his wife, his farm back in Missouri, his faith in most things good. The Arizona Territory had offered him a chance to disappear, to start over where nobody knew his name or his grief. Inside the modest cabin, Thomas laid the young woman on his own bed, the only one he had. He'd treated enough wounded soldiers during the war to know what needed doing. Her injuries were sericea, deep gash across her forehead, bruising along her ribs, and what looked like a bullet graze on her left shoulder. Whoever had done this, to her had meant to kill. Through the long night, Thomas worked by lamplight. He cleaned her wounds with whiskey, stitched what needed stitching, and wrapped her injuries in strips torn from his cleanest shirt. She stirred only once, her dark eyes fluttering open for just a moment. In that brief instant, Thomas saw something that stopped his breath, not fear, but a depth of pain that mirrored his own. When dawn broke across the desert, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Thomas stepped outside to check his animals. That's when he saw them. Apache warriors sat their horses in perfect silence along his fence line. He counted them quickly, 50, maybe more. They were armed with rifles and bows, their faces painted for war. At their head sat an older man with silver threading through his long hair and scars mapping his chest. The chief's eyes were fixed on Thomas with an intensity that could have melted steel. Thomas felt his mouth go dry, but he didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he raised his hand in a gesture of peace and walked slowly toward the fence. His boots crunched on the hard-packed earth, each step feeling like it might be his last. The chief urged his horse forward until only the fence separated them. When he spoke, his English was clear and measured, though his voice carried the weight of ancient authority. You have something that belongs to us, white man. Thomas met his gaze steadily. The girl, my daughter. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd been caring for a chief's daughter. Implications crashed over him like a flash flood. In the eyes of these warriors, he could be seen as anything from a kidnapper to something worse. Bad, Thomas said, his voice steady, despite the fear coursing through his veins. I found her dying near my fence. I've been trying to help her. The chief studied him for a long moment. Other warriors began to shift restlessly, their hands moving to their weapons. Thomas could feel the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. You will bring her out. Now. Thomas nodded and turned back toward his cabin. As he walked, he became aware of more movement in his peripheral vision. The 50 warriors he'd initially seen were just the beginning. Apache fighters seemed to materialize. From behind rocks, from arroyos, from the very desert itself. By his count, at least 300 warriors now surrounded his small ranch. Inside the cabin, the young woman was awake, struggling to sit up despite her injuries. Her dark eyes were alert now, taking in her surroundings with quick intelligence. Easy, Thomas said softly, approaching the bed with his hands visible. You're safe, but your father is outside with what looks like half the Apache nation. Studied his face, and Thomas found himself struck again by her beauty. Not just the classical features, but something deeper. an inner strength that radiated from her even in her weakened state. "You are Thomas McCarty," she said, her English accented but clear. Thomas stopped short. "How do you know my name?" Ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "I have been watching you." Before Thomas could process this revelation, heavy footsteps sounded on his porch. The door opened without ceremony, and the chief stepped inside, flanked by two younger warriors. His eyes went immediately to his daughter. "Yana," he said, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable. "Father." She struggled to sit up straighter. Wincing with the effort, "This man saved my life." The chief's eyes shifted back to Thomas, reassessing. "Tell me what happened." Yana spoke in rapid Apache, her voice growing stronger as she continued. Thomas caught a few words. He'd picked up bits of the language during his time in the territory, but most of it was lost on him. What he could read was the chief's changing expression, suspicion gradually giving way to something else. When Ayanna finished speaking, silence filled the small cabin. The chief looked at Thomas for a long moment before extending his hand. "I am Chief Nolnish. You have my gratitude." Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling the strength in the older man's grip, just doing what anyone would do. "No, Chief Nolnish," said firmly. "Not anyone. My daughter tells me you've been watching over her through the night. That you used your own medicine, your own blankets, your own bed to heal her. This is not what we expect from white men." Over the following days, as Ayanna recovered, Thomas found himself caught between two worlds. The Apache warriors remained camped around his ranch, but the hostile tension had eased into something more like watchful waiting. Chief Nolnish visited daily, sometimes bringing other tribal leaders to meet the white man who had saved his daughter. But it was Ayanna herself. Who fascinated Thomas most? As her strength returned, so did her spirit. She was intelligent, quick-witted, and possessed of a dry humor that caught him off guard. She spoke of books she'd read. Somehow she'd learned to read English from a missionary years ago, and of the changing world that was closing in around her people. "Why were you watching me?" Thomas asked one afternoon as she sat on his porch. Her injuries now healed enough to allow her to move around. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the desert horizon. "Your wife?" she said finally. "Is speaker name in your sleep?" Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Sarah, you loved her very much. She died in the war. Influenza took her while I was fighting in Virginia. By the time I got home, ... Thomas trailed off, the old pain as sharp as ever. "I know about losing someone you love," Ayanna said softly. "I was to be married, a warrior named Kestrel. He was killed by cavalry soldiers 2 seasons ago." They sat in companionable silence, both lost in memories of love and loss. Around them, the desert stretched endlessly, indifferent to human pain. "Is that why you were alone when I found you?" Ayanna's expression darkened. "There are those among my people who believe the old ways are finished, that we should surrender to the white man's reservations. They made an agreement with soldiers. I ... disagreed. So they tried to kill you? My own cousin? He thought my death would show my father that resistance was hopeless." Her voice carried a bitter edge. He was wrong. As the days passed, Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations more than he cared to admit. Ayanna had a way of seeing the world that challenged his assumptions. She spoke of her people's connection to the land of traditions that stretched back centuries, of the pain of watching everything familiar disappear. But there were lighter moments too. She laughed at his clumsy attempts to cook anything more complex than beans and hardtack. She taught him words in Apache, giggling when his pronunciation mangled the sounds. In return, he showed her a small collection of books. Watching her face light up as she discovered authors she'd never read, attraction between them grew slowly, like a desert flower opening to rain. Thomas told himself it was impossible, that the gulf between their worlds was too wide to bridge. But when Ayanna looked at him with those dark eyes, when her hand accidentally brushed his, when she smiled at something he'd said, he felt something he thought had died with Sarah. The reckoning came 3 weeks after he'd found her. Chief Nolnish arrived at dawn with a larger group of warriors than usual. His face was grim, and Thomas knew immediately that something had changed. "The cavalry is coming," the chief announced without preamble. "My scouts report soldiers, many soldiers, riding from Fort Verde. They will be here by midday." Thomas felt his blood chill. "How many? 2 companies, maybe more?" "Someone told them about my daughter being here. They come to take her and to take me." Ayanna appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her face pale but determined. "Father, you must go. Take our people and ride north to the mountains. I will not leave you, daughter, and I will not be the cause of our people's destruction." Her voice carried the same authority as her father's. "The soldiers want hostages to force our surrender. Do not give them what they want." Thomas watched the exchange, understanding the terrible choice before them. If the Apache stayed and fought, they would be slaughtered by superior numbers and firepower. If they ran, they would be pursued relentlessly. But if they left Ayanna behind, "There's another way," Thomas said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. Both father and daughter turned to look at him. "Marry her to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the stares of a dozen Apache warriors boring into him. "What did you say?" Chief Nalnish asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Thomas stepped forward, his resolve hardening. "If Ayanna is my wife under white man's law, the soldiers can't take her as a hostage. She'll be protected as the wife of an American citizen." "You would do this?" Ayanna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas met her eyes. "I would, if you'll have me." The proposal wasn't born of some sudden romantic gesture. It was practical, desperate even. But as Thomas looked at Ayanna, he realized that somewhere in the past weeks the impossible had happened. He'd fallen in love again. Chief Nalnish studied him for a long moment. "You understand what you are offering? To marry an Apache woman means you will forever be caught between worlds. Your own people will turn against you." "My own people turned against me long ago," Thomas replied. "When I came back from the war broken and empty, when I lost everything that mattered, this land has been kinder to me than civilization ever was." Ayanna stepped closer to him. "And you understand what you ask of me? To leave my people, my way of life?" "I ask you to save your people," Thomas said gently. "And maybe, maybe to save me too." The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning air. The cavalry was closer than expected, Chief Nalnish made his decision with the swift authority of a war leader. Do it. What followed was unlike any wedding ceremony Thomas could have imagined. With Apache warriors forming a protective circle and dust clouds on the horizon marking the approach of the cavalry, Chief Nalnish spoke words in his native tongue over Thomas and Ayanna. Thomas didn't understand most of what was said, but he felt the weight of tradition, of ancient bonds being forged. When it was done, Chief Nalnish placed his daughter's hand in Thomas's. "She is your wife now under our law. See that the white man's law agrees." The chief turned to his daughter, speaking rapidly in Apache. Ayanna nodded, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her father. Thomas watched the painful farewell, understanding that this might be the last time father and daughter saw each other. The Apache warriors melted away into the desert, as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only dust and the memory of their presence. Thomas and Ayanna stood alone on his porch as the cavalry column crested the ridge. Captain William Hayes of the 3rd Cavalry was a young officer with ambitious eyes and a regulation mustache. He rode up to Thomas's fence with 2 companies of soldiers spread behind him, their uniforms dark with sweat and their faces hard with purpose. "Thomas McCarty?" the captain called out. "That's right, I'm Captain Hayes. We've received reports that you've been harboring Apache fugitives on your property." Thomas felt Ayanna tense beside him, but his voice remained steady. "No fugitives here, Captain. Just me and my wife." Captain Hayes's eyes shifted to Ayanna, taking in her Apache features. "In traditional dress? Your wife?" "That's right. We were married this morning." The captain dismounted and approached the porch, his hand resting on his saber. "By what authority?" Thomas had been dreading this question. Under territorial law, marriages had to be performed by ordained ministers or justices of the peace. "Why, they'd done was legally meaningless. "We'll be making it official in town as soon as possible," Thomas said carefully. "But in the eyes of God and her people, we're married." Captain Hayes studied them both for a long moment. Thomas could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind. Arresting an Apache woman was one thing. Arresting the wife of an American citizen, under questionable circumstances, was quite another. "I'll need to see proof of this marriage," Hayes said finally. "And you'll have it," Thomas replied. "Give us a week to get to town and make the arrangements." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Captain Hayes nodded curtly. "1 week, McCarty. If you're not legally married by then, I'll be back for her." After the cavalry departed, Thomas and Ayanna sat in silence on the porch, both processing what had just happened. They were married in name, but strangers in fact. The weight of their decisions settled over them like evening shadows. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked. Ayanna was quiet for a long time. "Ask me in a year," she said finally. The trip to Phoenix took 3 days. Thomas had never felt more conscious of the stares and whispers that followed them. A white man traveling with an Apache. A woman was unusual enough. The fact that they claimed to be married sent shockwaves through every settlement they passed. Judge William Foster was a portly man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. He listened to their requests with growing amazement. "You want me to marry you to an Apache woman?" "Yes, sir." "And you understand the implications? The social ostracism? The legal complications?" Thomas looked at Ayanna, who sat straight-backed and dignified despite the hostile stares of the court clerk. Over the past week, he'd come to know her better. Her sharp wit, her quiet courage, her fierce loyalty to her people. What had begun as a desperate measure was becoming something else. "I understand, Your Honor, and I accept them willingly." Judge Foster performed the ceremony in his chambers, with only the court clerk as witness. The words were simple, official, and binding. Under territorial law, when it was done, Thomas and Ayanna were legally husband and wife, but legal recognition was only the beginning of their challenges. The boarding house where they'd planned to stay suddenly had no vacancies. The general store owner served them, but made his displeasure clear. On the street, respectable women crossed to the other side when they saw Ayanna coming. "I'm sorry," Thomas said as they sat in their wagon on the outskirts of town, preparing to make the long journey back to the ranch. "For what? For what you're giving up? Your people, your way of life, your future?" Yana turned to face him, her dark eyes serious. "You think I gave up my future, Thomas McCarty? You are my future now." The months that followed tested their marriage in ways neither had anticipated. Living together as husband and wife forced them to navigate not just cultural differences, but the complex emotions of two people learning to love again after loss. Ayanna proved to be remarkably adaptable. She learned to cook white man's food, though she quietly improved every recipe with herbs and spices from her homeland. She helped with the ranch work, demonstrating a knowledge of horses and cattle that impressed Thomas. Most importantly, she slowly began to trust him with her heart. Thomas, for his part, discovered that falling in love for the second time was both easier and harder than the first. Easier because he understood now how precious love was, how quickly it could be lost. Harder because his heart carried scars from Sarah's death, fears of losing someone he cared about again. Their relationship deepened gradually. Conversations by the fire, shared laughter over small domestic disasters. The moment when Ayanna first called him husband without hesitation, the night when Thomas woke from a nightmare about the war and found her holding him, whispering words of comfort. In Apache, but their growing happiness was shadowed by the world outside their ranch. Apache raids continued throughout the territory. Each attack brought more pressure on the government to find a final solution to the Apache problem. Chief Nalnish and his band remained free, but the army's pursuit was relentless. The crisis came in early spring. Thomas was in Phoenix buying supplies when he overheard a conversation that chilled his blood. A group of territorial officials were discussing plans for a final offensive against the Apache. They had located Chief Nolnish's hideout in the mountains. More troubling still, they intended to use Ayanna as bait. McCarty's squaw knows where her father is hiding, one of the men was saying. We bring her in, threaten to hang her for treason, and the old chief will come running. Thomas rode home harder than he'd ever ridden in his life. He found Ayanna working in the small garden she'd planted behind their cabin, coaxing vegetables. From the desert soil, she looked up at his approach, immediately reading the urgency in his face. What is it? They're coming for you. Tonight, probably, we have to run. Ayanna straightened slowly, dirt falling from her hands. Where would we go? This is our home. Anywhere but here. Mexico, maybe? Or California. And abandon my father to face the army alone? Thomas dismounted and took her hands in his. Ayanna, if they take you, they'll use you to force your father's surrender. He'll come for you, and when he does, they'll kill you both. Then we warn him how we don't even know where he is. Ayanna smiled, and in that smile Thomas saw both the woman he'd fallen in love with and the Apache warrior's daughter she would always be. I know where he is. I've always known. They left the ranch that evening, taking only what they could carry on horseback. Thomas felt a pang of regret as he looked back at the small cabin he'd built with his own hands. The life he'd created in the Arizona desert. But then he looked at Ayanna, and he knew he was making the right choice. The ride into the mountains took 2 days. Ayanna led them along paths that seemed to exist only in her memory, through canyons and across mesas that white men had never mapped. Thomas marveled at her knowledge of the land. The way she read signs in bent grass and scattered stones. They found Chief Nolech's camp in a hidden valley, protected by steep walls and accessible only through a narrow canyon. The Apache had been there for months, Thomas realized, living off the land and staying one step ahead of the cavalry. The reunion between father and daughter was emotional. Chief Nolech embraced Ayanna with tears in his eyes, speaking rapidly in Apache. When he turned to Thomas, there was gratitude in his weathered face. You brought her safely to me. She brought herself, Thomas replied. I just rode along. That night, around the council fire, Thomas and Ayanna shared their news about the coming offensive. The Apache leaders listened grimly as the details were revealed. They had perhaps a week before the cavalry found them. We cannot fight to companies of soldiers, one of the war leaders said. Not here, not with our families to protect. Then we run again, another replied, as we have always run. No, Chief Nolech's voice cut through the debate. I am tired of running. My people are tired of running. Our children deserve better than to spend their lives fleeing from soldiers.
Then,
what do you propose, father? Ayanna asked. The old chief was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a leader who had carried his people's burdens for too long. Surrender. The word fell into the gathering like a stone into still water. Thomas saw the shock on the faces around the fire, the disbelief and anger. Father, no, Ayanna protested. Yes, daughter, the time for fighting is over. The white man's world has swallowed ours. We can die as warriors, or we can live as people in cages. For our children's sake, we must choose life. The debate that followed was passionate and painful. Thomas remained silent, understanding that this was not his place to speak. But he watched Ayanna's face in the firelight, saw the anguish there. As she grappled with her father's decision, when the council finally ended, most of the Apache had agreed to surrender. They would go to the reservation, they would learn the white man's ways. They would try to preserve what they could of their culture in a world that no longer had room for it. What about you, Chief Nolech? Asked Thomas, as the gathering dispersed. Will you come with us to the reservation? Thomas looked at Ayanna, then back at her father. If that's what Ayanna wants. No, Ayanna said firmly. The reservation is no place for you, husband, and it is no place for us to build a life together.
right.
Then, what? Ayanna took his hand, her fingers warm in the cool mountain air. We go back to our ranch. We build the life we started. We wait. Wait for what? For the world to change, for understanding to grow, for our children to inherit a better future than the one we were given. The Apache surrender took place. 3 days later in the valley below, Chief Nolnish's camp. Thomas and Ayanna watched from a hidden overlook as the tribal leaders met with cavalry officers under a flag of truce. The negotiation was brief and one-sided. The Apache would go to the San Carlos reservation. They would give up their weapons and their horses. They would submit to white authority. In return, they would not be killed. Thomas saw Chief Nolnish hand over his rifle, watched as proud warriors were disarmed and counted like cattle. It was one of the most heartbreaking sights he'd ever witnessed, and he'd seen the aftermath of Civil War battles. "I should be with them," Ayanna whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Your father didn't want that for you. He wanted you to be free." "Free to do what? To live between worlds belonging to neither?" Thomas turned to face her fully. "Free to choose your own path. Free to love who you want to love. Free to raise children who might live in a world where Apache and white can coexist." They returned to their ranch a week later to find it exactly as they'd left it. The cabin, the fences, the small garden, everything waited for them as if they'd never been gone. But everything had changed too. The Apache wars were effectively over. The old way of life was ending. That first night back, Thomas and Ayanna sat on their porch and watched the stars emerge in the desert sky. They were alone now in a way they'd never been before, cut off from her people and isolated from his. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Ayanna asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. Their marriage had begun as a desperate measure, a way to save her life and protect her people. But it had become something else, something real and deep, and worth fighting for. "I think we made the only choice we could live with," he said finally. The seasons turned, and slowly, painfully, they built a new kind of life together. Thomas expanded the ranch, hiring hands who were willing to work for a man married to an Apache woman. There weren't many, but there were some. Ayanna established relationships with other women in the territory. Not friendships exactly, but working relationships built on mutual respect. The real test came when Ayanna announced she was pregnant. Thomas had never wanted children with Sarah. The war had made the world seem too dangerous, too uncertain. Belly grew around with their child. He felt something he hadn't expected. Hope for the future. Their son was born on a spring morning when the desert was painted with wildflowers. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and when Thomas held him for the first time, he understood what Chief Nolnish had meant about children deserving better. They named him David, after the biblical king who brought peace to his people. Chief Nolnish came to see his grandson when the boy was 6 months old. The old chief looked older, worn down by reservation life, but his eyes lit up when he held David. "He will live in both worlds," the chief said, "Apache and white. Perhaps he will help them understand each other." The Arizona territory was changing rapidly. Towns were growing, railroads were coming, and the wild frontier was becoming civilized. There would be challenges ahead for David, caught between cultures as he was. But there would be opportunities too as the years passed. Thomas and Ayanna's love deepened and matured. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Sarah Hope, after Thomas's first wife and for the future she represented, and another son they called Joseph. The ranch prospered. It's becoming known throughout the territory for its quality horses and cattle. The hardest moments came when Apache families would stop by the ranch. Former warriors, now reduced to begging for food or work, Ayanna always fed them, always found some task they could do to earn a few dollars. Thomas never complained, understanding that this was her way of staying connected to her people. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked one evening, 10 years after their wedding. They were sitting on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. David was teaching his younger siblings Apache words while they practiced their English. "Alphabet. Regret what?" "Marrying me. Giving up your life with your people." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, her eyes following their children's games. "I gave up one life to find another," she said finally. "I regret the world that made the choice necessary. But I do not regret the choice itself." Thomas reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as they had that first night when he'd found her dying in the dust. "I love you," he said. Words that had become easier to say over the years, but no less meaningful. "And I love you, husband. In this life, and whatever comes after." The sun was setting over the Arizona desert, painting painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound was answered by another. Their children's laughter carried on the evening breeze, mixing Apache and English in the unconscious way of the truly bilingual. Thomas squeezed Ayana's hand and marveled at the strange path that had brought them together. He'd found her dying in the dust, an enemy's daughter bleeding out beside his fence. She'd become his salvation, his second chance at love, the mother of his children, his partner in building a bridge between two worlds. It hadn't been easy. There had been heartbreak, sacrifice, and moments when the future seemed impossible to imagine. But they had endured, and in enduring, they had created something new, a family that belonged fully to neither the Apache world nor the white world, but somehow to both. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas reflected on the choices that had brought them to this moment. The decision to help a dying woman, the desperate proposal that had saved her life, the choice to build a life together despite all the obstacles in their path. Love, he realized, was often born not in moments of joy, but in moments of crisis. It was forged not in comfort but in the shared struggle to create something better than what came before. He and Ayana had found each other in the dust and darkness. Together they had built something that would outlast them both. Their children would face their own challenges, caught between worlds as they were, but they would face them with the strength of both their heritages.